In this episode of Report to Wyoming, I get to talk to Tom Rea. He's a historian and a writer with the Wyoming History Project. We talk about Mathew Campfield. He was a black man who came to Casper at the turn of the century. Campfield was well known as a barber, but he was also elected as a Natrona County coroner in 1892 and 1894. I love getting to talk to Tom about Wyoming history. I feel really lucky that I get to invite people like him to come to the radio station and tell cool stories. So I hope you like it too.
He's a really interesting guy, and just because of Army pension bureaucracy, there's a big file on him because he had an Army pension. He was a black man. He was born in slavery in Georgia. He served in the Civil War in Arkansas and the USCI, U.S. Colored Infantry.
Do you mind if I interrupt a couple
No.
times? So, if he was enslaved and then serving in the Civil War, was he fighting for his own slavery?
Well, he would have been emancipated. That would have probably been one reason he joined the Army, was to secure his emancipation, I would expect. So these were free men, free black men who were fighting in the Union Army. About halfway through the Civil War, they started these black regiments, and they armed these guys, and this was a huge cultural thing to see black men in uniform with guns. And they fought well for the whole second half of the Civil War, including this one regiment that was in Arkansas.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. A lot of people don't know that, yeah. And so after he was mustered out at the end of the war, he was mustered out at Fort Leavenworth, which is in northeastern Kansas, on the Missouri River. He was around there for a while. He was a barber and did other things. He ended up further west in Kansas, kind of as maybe a servant, sort of, for a well-known Army officer named Wynkoop, who was connected a lot to Indian policy on the plains and in Colorado, especially later. And then after a while, he ends up in Rock River, Wyoming. By now the railroad has been built, and by the late 1870s, Rock River, which is 45 miles northwest of Laramie on Route 30, you know that? You've been by there probably if you ever drive.
I think, what's that, 2 hours away from us maybe?
Yeah, probably about that. Yeah,
Okay.
an hour and a half to Medicine Bow and another, yeah.
It's
a little while
gorgeous.
from that. It is gorgeous down there.
How did you end up over here?
So, and he was working there, and he was married by then, and then a new railroad was built past Douglas to Casper, and so that Rock River, which had been a major shipping point, jumping off point for the cattle business, it was the shortest way at the time to get from the railroad all the way up to the Powder River Basin up around Buffalo, which was booming with cattle then. And so he was there for a while, being a barber and doing other things, and then when the railroad came to Douglas and Glen Rock and Casper, a different railroad, he came up here and was in Casper in its earliest years, so 1889, 1890, around there.
Walter Jones, I know this is maybe
Yeah.
called just the sandbar at this point.
Right. And so this was even before the sandbar was even part of town. So right up town was just, what's now pretty much the intersection of 2nd and Center Street was the middle of town. There was an earlier version of town over by where Bosco's is, A Street, and about, McKinley. But that was the first sort of commercial establishment, but then they moved it over here to pretty much where it is now.
I wonder about the culture of Wyoming back then. I mean, staying in the South would have been hard for a black person.
Yep.
Because I'm just trying to picture Wyoming as a neutral space. Do you think there's any truth in that? Maybe it would have been more attractive. Like, why did he come to Wyoming? He could be a barber anywhere.
That's a good question. And I don't know that we really know, except that he must have been following work. He was a barber because he didn't have any feet. He was while he was still working for that guy Wynkoop in Kansas and connected with Army people, he was driving a wagon one winter. This would be about 1867, so not long after he'd left Leavenworth, in a blizzard, and he froze his feet. a doctor found him still in an Army kind of hospital about year and a half after it had happened, and did a more proper amputation. And he had wooden feet, 2 wooden feet, so he couldn't walk around much.
How high was the amputation?
At his ankle.
Okay.
And so he might have been able to stand on them all day to cut hair, or he might have sit on a tall stool. I don't really know. There's one wonderful photograph of him, which you can see on wyohistory.org, which is he's right out here on North Center Street. The barber shop was right about half a block south of 2nd and Center on the west side, the old Wonder Bar side, the Rib and Chop House side.
Oh, okay.
And there was and he was next to a drugstore on one side, and the Wyoming Derrick, which was a newspaper office. He was right between them. And there's a picture of him sitting on the hitching rail there. He's a big man, kind of looking around over his shoulder and smoking a little cigar, kind of smiling at the camera. A bunch of other people in the camera too, but there's a lot of personality in that photo. Yeah.
And he wouldn't have been the only black person. And I'm just getting this from Jones's book.
Right.
There were more black people in the 1920s and 30s, but would he have been? Probably very few.
Not many. I mean, there were only 500 people in Casper at the time. And how many of those were African American? That's a good question. We should look that up and see if we can find some census data. His wife was with him also all this time, and
she was a slave as well.
Yeah,
right?
She'd been a slave as well. Her name was Fanny Davis, and he must have been pretty well liked in town, because twice in a row, so 2 different times, 2 years apart, he was elected Natrona County coroner. And there's a story in that article which I think really is revealing about how things worked, and it's about race and culture and time and being in a small town. So he had this barbershop. In the back there was a bathtub, and if you wanted, you could pay 50 cents more for a bath. And this cowboy named George Mitchell must have thought it would be pretty funny, stole the bathtub one day and took it out to Alcova and put it in the hot springs there, right where the notch where the dam is now, the Alcova Dam. There was the hot springs there, and so he put the dam, probably where the hot water would flow into it, and you could get a nice bath. And instead of complaining to the sheriff, or even going to George Mitchell, the cowboy who took the bathtub, every time somebody came in looking for a bath, Matt Campfield would make a mark on the wall, and then after it got up to 70 marks at 50 cents a piece, that's $35. And George Mitchell by then had opened a lumber yard in Casper, and George Mitchell was actually one of the first mayors of Casper, and had this lumber business for some time after that. And Matt Campfield went to him and said, well, you've now robbed me of $35 worth of my income, so how about if you give me $35 worth of lumber, and which would have been a lot. And so he got the lumber, and he had a piece of land that he'd filed on just out west of town, which is about where Fort Casper is now, and he had a homestead there, and so he was, I'm sure, building sheds and corrals and stuff out there.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So instead of a confrontation that could have gotten him killed, probably, he kept a long memory, and he made it public. So everybody went in there and knew what those marks were about, and so eventually, probably not wanting to look like the wild young cowboy who thought a joke probably what other people might not thought was so funny, felt that it was in his interest to pay up. So that's just that's a interesting story.
I just think about the nexus of people who come into a barber shop at that time too. Well, and I wonder how that plays a role in his character in the town and being liked and charismatic. Maybe people felt like they could trust him. I always say my hairdresser is a counselor in so many ways, and so I wonder how that kind of factored into it. We'll never know all those little things, but
Mhm.
it's certainly interesting. So many guys probably would have gone in there to get groomed, and
Yeah.
you're sort of vulnerable in those positions too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and it's a very male place, and also a talking place. So, like my barber here in town he tells great stories, and they're different every time, and they're always interesting. And so that's one reason I like going there. And there's always often one or two other people in there, and people listen to each other. People are courteous. Nobody ever talks about politics, and but people talk a lot about cars and hunting and fishing, and it's yeah. So maybe that was the case then too. So yeah.
And so then he was a coroner.
Oh yeah, and that's right. They were in Buffalo, Wyoming territory for a while before they came to Casper, and he also cut hair up there. Buffalo was a brand new town in 1879 and 80 after the end of the Indian Wars, and it was opening up for cattle in a big hurry. And there was an army base up there at Fort McKinney, just west of Buffalo, and his wife Fanny cooked and kept house for the colonel of the regiment there, and in Buffalo, and he cut hair then too, and he ran for the territorial legislature. He's on the ballot there too. Matt Campfield is, and he got one vote, so it was probably him.
But he was ambitious.
Yeah, and publicly minded, maybe, And so, because in Natrona County, 15 years later, he got elected coroner twice. And I wonder if coroner meant he was also sort of an undertaker. Maybe he was doing that for people too. I don't know if there was. I don't know. That'd be interesting to try to find out. Yeah.
I wonder if he was well-to-do. Did he make good money? Do you know?
No, he was. So because of his. So after he got to Casper, he started filing paperwork to get a Union Army pension. This is why we know as much about him as we do. And in order to, so he qualified as a veteran of the Union Army. He qualified for a pension of $12 a month, which he eventually got. But that takes a lot of paperwork, and in order to make that happen, you have to file a lot of people, a variety of people, maybe 5 or 6 people, write affidavits, long letters attesting to your good character. And so these papers are in the National Archives in Washington D.C. And the huge bureaucracy that was the Pension Bureau was the first really big federal bureaucracy that grew up after the Civil War, when there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and many tens of thousands of those maybe were wounded, and so were eligible for pensions. And so that's what, I guess his wounded feet must have counted. I don't think he was still in the Army then, but somehow that made him eligible for a pension. He got the pension, but he was a big guy, and his health wasn't very good, and I'm sure, just having wooden feet for the whole second half of your life is hard on your health in a lot of ways. And so he died of a heart attack in Casper in 1897, I think, or 8. He left $1,200 in debts, and his wife, we have that record because she was selling stuff to pay off his debts.
Oh,
Household
poor
goods.
Fanny.
Yeah.
Did they have children?
Not that I know of. No, I don't think so. And we also know a lot about her because she applied for a widow's pension, which would have been $8 a month. And by then she was back in Leavenworth, where she had other family. And this went on for a long time, and one white man tried to help her for a long time, and then he actually took off with a bunch of her money and left town. Some other guy tried to help her for a while, and finally, and so there were people, is this interesting? There were people called pension examiners, I learned, who worked for the government, whose job it was to go out and interview these people who'd written these affidavits. This is how closely the government was checking on, did people really deserve these pensions or not? And so he interviewed several people around Kansas who'd known him, who spoke well of him and spoke highly of his character and of hers. But then they found a record, a marriage record, I think in Fort Leavenworth, that showed that Campfield had been married in the mid or late 1860s to a woman named Pauline somebody.
Oh.
And never divorced. There was no record of any divorce. He may have only been married for a few weeks. She may even have been a prostitute. It's hard to tell. And but there was never any divorce record. So, and he and Fanny had been married in the mid 1870s, and so that meant that she wasn't his legal wife, and so she never got the pension.
Oh my gosh, I wonder if that was news to her as well, that he
I'm
had
sure
a
it was.
previous wife.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's kind of sad.
It is kind of sad.
It seems like back then so many, that like even the feet, and having to wear wooden feet.
Yeah.
Or prosthetics. You would never want to walk around on wood. I had wooden crutches once as a kid, because in Sublette County, for some reason, we didn't have any metal crutches laying around. And my mom put little like dish towels around the armpit, and my blisters were so bad.
Yeah.
And I had to wear those for like use them for 3 months. I can't imagine your feet being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man.
So I always think about history, and I think people just, you didn't have a lot of choices. It was just like suck it up or die.
Yeah.
They had to deal with so much. I wonder if there was any, I think about child mortality. Maybe they tried to have children.
Yeah.
Because it's not like birth control was
No.
a thing, so.
No. There's a whole nother interesting layer of this story, if you're interested, which is that, so in 1936, with New Deal WPA funding, Casper was reconstructing Fort Casper. So this was like a replica. Those buildings out there those log buildings out there now were built in the 1930s on the exact footprint, the exact foundations of the original buildings, but they are buildings that were built in the 30s. And while this was going on, people were digging around. They found, this was in the paper, they found some human leg bones. And the sheriff, Jack Allen, the Natrona County Sheriff, tells the paper, "Oh, those must be the bones of that guy who lost his legs, that old Uncle Matt," they called him, the black man, who didn't have any legs. Well, then it turned out it was only one leg, and then the paper decided it was somebody else entirely, a guy who owned the bridge there at Fort Casper for a while in the 1860s, Guinard. They decided it was his leg. So that was wrong. And then, but the paper was satisfied for itself for a while. And then they got a long letter from W.S. Kimball, who was the same guy who had founded the Wyoming Derrick in the 1890s, the longtime newspaper guy himself. And he had this, so it was his newspaper office that was right next door to Matt's barbershop. And he remembered him quite well and said, no, his name was not Matt Canfield, it was Matt Campfield. And we all knew him well, and everybody liked him, and he was the coroner and told all the pretty much correct stuff about it, plus a lot more information. And so that letter ran in the Casper paper in 1936. And after that, it became clear that, he'd been buried in Highland Cemetery, but there was no marker on the grave. And so the black community in Casper, they had a raffle then in 1936 to start. I think the the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Casper, had a raffle to raise money for a gravestone. They got some of it, and really they didn't really get all the money together for another almost 15 years, and finally put together enough to get him a gravestone, and he has a nice big headstone over there now. And there's he had a wooden marker after with a star, with a little metal rod with a metal star on the end. It says GAR. Those are markers for Union veterans. Grand Army of the Republic is a Union Army veterans organization, and you see those even still in graves sometimes. You see those GAR markers. He had one of those, and also instrumental in all this was W.S. Kimball's daughter, Ednis Kimball, for whom the park is named east of town, Ednis Kimball Wilkins, who by the late 50s was a legislator, was a representative in the Wyoming House of Representatives, and she helped make all this come about. So,
what about the park in North Casper? I think a lot of us have seen his name.
Yeah.
It's the Mathew Campfield Park, right?
Right.
And so if you've seen that and you're listening, you never knew what it was.
Right.
Now you know.
Now you know.
How did that become memorialized to him?
I don't know that. That's It's fairly recent, I think. Maybe only in the last 30 years or so that it's had that name. But I should be.
Yeah. So his legacy, he really was a special guy in this community, and even now, kids are going to see that.
Yeah.
And maybe they won't know who he is, but it's crazy that his name still means so much.
Yeah, and after we published a shorter version of this in the Wyoming Historical Society newsletter just last month, it's February now, just last month, and after that, I was in two things happened. Talk about family memories and family stories. I was at the once a month meeting of the Natrona County Historical Society, and this one guy comes up to me, Doug Cooper, who Doug loves everything about local history and knows a whole lot, and his grandfather, some very long generations in that Cooper family. He said, my grandfather, he knew him, he knew Matt Campfield, Uncle Matt, everybody called him Uncle Matt, and my granddad would borrow money from him, 12%, that was the going rate then, said Doug, and Matt was lending people money. I thought, well, that's interesting. That doesn't, And the other thing was, I got an email from Nancy Curtis in Glendo, Wyoming, and she's recently retired as the longtime publisher of High Plains Press, a publishing company in Glendo, which has published a lot of really great books about Wyoming history over the years. So she knows a whole lot, and she has a long memory. And she sent me this really nice email about, so she remembers George Mitchell, the cowboy who stole the bathtub. For much of the second half of his life, he had a ranch on the North Laramie River, was neighbors of her family on that, that same part of Wyoming, and they remembered him as a kind of a stone-faced old guy sitting in a three-piece suit in his living room and drinking whiskey all day. And
what year did you say he died?
He died in 1898, I think.
So it's over 120 years.
Yeah.
But still, that's only maybe 2 people ago.
Right.
Less than that.
Right.
So these oral histories, we talked about sources last time.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you get some of the really good, touching stuff from those, like Uncle Matt.
Yeah.
But then other records, where else were you able to find stuff? The military records, you said.
Right. He has military records, and then these pension records, which is sort of a different category from, there's Civil War military records, which will show you when someone was, when he enlisted, when he was promoted, and when he was mustered out, which means when he left the service. And so we know that Matt Campfield was a musician. So he would have been in the regimental band, and eventually he was a head musician, so he was the leader of the band. And but that's about all you know from those records. But these pension records are full of information. And then that long letter that Ednis Kimball's father wrote to the paper in the mid-1930s is also packed with a lot of information about the Campfields. So those are the main sources for this article. Yeah.
Do we know anything about his character, just adjectives for a personality that we could piece together?
Yeah. Just that people seem to be telling the government that he was a good and reliable man who, I guess, paid his bills. Well, maybe not if he had $1,200 in debts when he died. And the fact that he was elected, so people would have known him and liked him, I think.
Okay.
And that they called him Uncle Matt, and they called her Aunt Fanny, and that's kind of a patronizing thing. I mean, it's a race thing too to call elderly black people Uncle and Aunt.
Oh.
And that's that was common throughout the USA for a long time.
What about the photographs that you have? Where were you able to find those?
At the Casper College Western History Center.
Oh, so sorry.
Especially that one of Matt, and then there's another one. They have two of him, one about just a head and shoulders portrait of him, and then that one I told you about him and some other people on Center Street, including him sitting on the hitching rail looking over his shoulder. That barber shop he owned, Kimball, who had the print shop and the newspaper, then also owned the space that was a drugstore, was renting it on the other side of Matt, and then later bought that building, and the barber shop was in the other half of that same building, and so he wanted to expand into the drugstore, and so he evicted Matt Campfield, and Campfield wasn't particularly pleased about that, as you might imagine. Maybe that's when he stopped being a barber. And but the day that Campfield, or shortly after Campfield moved out, according to this long letter that W.S. Kimball wrote in the 1930s, so which would have been almost 40 years later, there was a shootout on Center Street that day, and there were some bullets that came into what only recently had been the barber shop and slammed into the wall right behind where Matt would have been standing. So Kimball was able to tell Matt, by evicting you, I saved your life. And so Campfield says, yeah, well, maybe. But so.
Plus, it really paints a picture of how wild and dangerous Casper would have been.
Yeah.
A lot of gambling, fighting.
Right.
Jones's book really paints that picture too, where there would have been a menagerie of just crazy characters running around.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and that whole stuff. Walters talks about that in that book, I think, doesn't he? About how respectable women did not walk on the west side of Center Street. Only the east. I think it's one side or the other.
And it was a violent place.
Yeah.
There was a lot of violence. And that's amazing how it was chronicled. There were always little presses, or the Casper Star Tribune even has done a lot of digging. Mm-hmm. But and he must have liked Campfield, because he ended up staying here till the very end.
Yeah, right. So he was here probably about maybe as much as 10 years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he had to have had some
longer
grit.
than in any of those other places.
I guess he would have been. He missed like Prohibition.
Right.
Was booze legal before he died?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Wyoming outlawed liquor about a year before the nation outlawed liquor. So, and that was 1920 when Prohibition began nationally.
Okay.
Other states were doing it ahead of time. Wyoming just a little bit ahead of time. Yeah.
That's a whole nother story.
That's a whole nother
we have
story.
to get into, because I
very
love
much the Sandbar is very much a part of that story, because that's where all the cafes and bars and speakeasies were.
And then when I was thinking about Black history, that's where I was originally thinking about, because there were so many Black musicians and clubs, and that would have been a place where whites and Blacks would get together. Of course, it was always top secret, and those were where the fun parties were at.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there's this woman, I don't know if you've heard of her. I think I may have emailed you this, but have you heard of the Queen of the Sandbar?
What was her name? Do you remember?
I think it was Virginia. She was a wealthy Black woman who owned a lot lot of brothels. She made her money with these little, like, kind of wooden shacks and tents, and she was a madam and a business owner. Yeah. And I didn't realize that there were so many Black people in Casper at the time. There really were. And there were actually a lot of, it was a very diverse place in general, because there were different walks of life coming to work. There was a lot of opportunity. So that just brought a lot of people. So I do think Wyoming was a lot more neutral than the North and the South following the Civil War. I just am inferring that. And then maybe even in the 1920s, it was just a place where people felt comfortable. Like, it was just as dangerous for everybody as, as it would have been no matter what.
And Casper, was so much part of the oil business,
Right.
as well as a shipping place for cattle and sheep. But but especially the boom got really hot and going in the late 19 teens, when Salt Creek oil field was booming, and there was more oil coming out of Salt Creek than any other oil field in the world there for a few years. And it was, and so that kind of money was what was being spent down there on the sandbar. Yeah.
I imagine it was very fun and exciting.
Yeah.
A lot of energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of single men looking for entertainment. So that's why
Brothels were a good business.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting. I'll try to find a picture of her for our listeners.
Yeah.
I have a photo gallery. I used some of the photos that you had sent.
Great.
Which is great. And then, so you can find pictures of the one that he's talking about, Mathew Campfield there. I think there were a few that I was able to find, either from you or Hans with the Western History, or what is it, Western History Archives?
Center. It's called the
Center.
Casper College Western History Center. It is an
Gotcha.
archive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some pictures I'll see are labeled Casper College Archives, and I'm like, oh, and then the Western History Center.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's all the same place.
And he was pretty helpful too. So that's,
Yes, he
we've
is.
got like 56 photos.
Oh, wow, great.
So,
Cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
But then also, you can read Tom's story at, is it WyomingHistoryProject.org?
No, it's just called
Oh, sorry.
YO History, yohistory.org.
Okay.
Yep. You can find lots more information on Wyoming history on yohistory.org. There's hundreds of articles, there's field trip suggestions, there's many historic photos, there's maps, there's current today photos, there's activities, there's history itineraries in Wyoming, and much more. So I hope you'll check it out. yohistory.org is a project of the Wyoming Historical Society, nonprofit membership organization. Thanks.